Today on Stronger Than Reason, we dig into the roots of new wave with The Cars. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So, you might think I'm crazy to talk about this band. What do they have to do with the very best electronic alternative and industrial music from the 80s and 90s? And I get it. But I'm here to tell you that they have a lot to do with it, and today I'm going to explain how. You might think they aren't alternative at all, but baby, it's untrue. They might never have been alternative with a capital A, but they were lowercase alternative when they formed in 1976. They were an alternative to the late 70s excesses of prog rock, arena rock, disco, and sickly sweet schmaltz. And try saying that 3 times real fast. They were something new, a new something or other, maybe a wave of some kind. Yeah, a new wave of music, one that was distinguished by tight songs, pop hooks, close harmonies, and last but definitely not least, keyboards. And that's right, the Cars were maybe the first band to feature keyboards as co-equal with guitars on the rock stage. They had a keyboardist and a guitarist who were talented enough and humble enough to generously share that particular mid-range band of the frequency spectrum. And the musical range of the Cars was just incredible. Not only were the band members musically gifted, especially compared to their contemporaries, but they happened to have not one but 2 world-class lead singers with vastly different sounds, to the point where you'd be forgiven for thinking their songs were by 2 different bands. Now, am I a huge Cars fan? You know what? Not really. I mean, I've developed a very strong appreciation for them now as an adult, but I've never waved the flag of fandom per se. And you have to understand that the Cars were always just there for me and other Gen Xers, because they achieved fame in the late 70s when we were still very little kids. Their self-titled debut album dropped in 1976, for crying out loud, when I was literally crying out loud in preschool, when my idea of music was probably still focused on the sing-alongs in Romper Room. So that first album, by the way, was maybe as impressive a first album as ever existed. Even today, it's something of a best of. It's just downright ridiculous how successful it was. And by the time I was a tween in the early to mid-80s, the Cars had been dominating the charts. They were fully established. They featured prominently in Live Aid in 1985, cementing their place in rock history, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. So the Cars were just part of my upbringing. They were part of the tapestry of top 40 rock through my teen years. They were very prominent on MTV, especially the videos for You Might Think and Magic, which I have seen about 100,000 times, and so I was well aware of the band, and I liked their music that I'd heard for sure, but was I a fan? Well, what is fandom? You know, in my day, it meant ponying up for their music and maybe scratching their logo or their name on your history book or your jeans jacket, you know. And I did pony up for some of their music, specifically for a copy of their greatest hits tape, which came out in 1985. Now, you might ask why I'm dropping in a picture here, and I'm embarrassed to say it's because I couldn't find the tape. That's right, I went spelunking through the archives and just came up totally empty. And I can picture this cassette. I know exactly where it should be, but I just couldn't find the stupid thing. I swear it's in there somewhere, though. And I'm just throwing in a picture here for the sake of giving those on YouTube something nice to look at. Sorry, folks, it's the best I can do. I do own an electronic copy of this album too, but, you know, it doesn't do me much good when I'm trying to show something on the video. Oh well, but you know what? I think that the Cars' greatest hits was, in fact, the first cassette tape, the first cassette album that I bought with my own money back in the day, which is weird because it came out in 85, so I don't know, I was 12 or 13 or so when it came out, and that's older than I would have expected. So I guess I just hadn't been into music that much until then. I figure I was probably spending all my Christmas money on comic books, if I recall. Music didn't really come around for me until my early teens, so I guess that tracks. And I remember scanning the cassettes at my local music store. I almost certainly had a gift certificate to burn. Those used to come around on birthdays and whatnot. I mean, I doubt it was my idea, is my point, at that tender age to go buy an album. So I'm sure I had maybe $10 that I had to spend there. And knowing me, I'm sure I scrutinized every single thing in the store, probably taking an hour and a half while my parents were standing there tapping their feet. And finally, I decided that the Cars' greatest hits was the thing most worth buying. And I'm sure I was influenced by seeing them on MTV. In fact, I remember that MTV did a big retrospective of the best videos of 1984, and You Might Think was a part of that. My sister and I had taped it on our VCR and just watched that over and over. And I remember for sure You Might Think, and I remember Van Halen's Jump, and I remember The Reflex by Duran Duran, because that was a special favorite of ours. Maybe I should do a Duran Duran episode someday, because for a bunch of pretty boys, they're actually pretty talented. Anyway, I'm sure that this MTV special was just rattling around in my head when I bought this tape, and I was happy that I was going to have a copy of You Might Think and Magic that I could listen to in my own home. And this must have been around the time I got my first stereo system. I remember my sister got one first, and she promptly went out and bought Sports by Huey Lewis and the News, and that was their big breakthrough album with the heart of rock and roll. So yeah, I was pretty jealous. She also introduced me to the concept of dubbing cassettes and making your own covers. And if I recall, she had a copy of Reckless by Bryan Adams that she had gotten from somewhere, and that's the one with Summer of '69, which I still think of as an unimpeachably great song, one that my early band would cover. But, it turns out you really do need a keyboard player to pull it off. Guitar alone just won't do, I'm sorry. But she got some paper and some markers and got creative and made her own tape cover. And I was pretty blown away by that idea, being a somewhat arty and creative kid myself. So needless to say, my first stereo soon followed, and I too was taping music off the radio and from friends and, mostly my sister at first, and making my own cassette covers. Good times, good times. You can't do that with your fancy streams now, can ya? No. So I normally do a segment on when I first heard the album or band, and I can't do that here because I don't really remember first hearing the Cars, because like I said, they were always just there. They were on the radio and so on. But my recent interest in them stemmed, as you might know, from doing episode 56, the one about Weezer's Blue album, since I found out that their producer was none other than the Cars' Rick Ocasek. Turns out Weezer has had a long association with the Cars. In fact, when the Cars reunited to play at their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2018, Weezer's own Scott Schreiner filled in for Benjamin Orr on bass. An honor indeed. So, since doing that episode, it occurred to me that I'd never really seen the Cars perform live. So since then, I fell down this rabbit hole of checking out their old performances. And wow, I was just really blown away. I mean, naturally, you can find recordings of all their old stuff going back to the 70s and early 80s, and it's clear these guys were real players, to the point where a lot of other musicians looked up to them. And those old performances were just great. And I finally did watch their set at Live Aid at the stage in Philadelphia, and I was just blown away. They played just 4 tunes, but they all just sounded fantastic. The only thing that stops the party is during You Might Think, when there's a brief cutaway to show Phil Collins' plane landing. And, even back then, I wouldn't have given a crap about Phil Collins. I mean, who cares? I mean, Phil Collins is, a good guy, but he was objectively adult rock, and the Cars were for the kids. But this show was especially poignant, given that they wouldn't last much longer as a full band, and it would show them arguably at the height of their power. After all, Live Aid was in July of 1985, and the Greatest Hits album came out in October the same year. And I said it before, but I don't remember watching Live Aid at all, which is weird because my family liked music. We liked rock music. My folks did, my sister and I. I think it was, I was too young to be into Live Aid, just to sit and watch an all-day broadcast like that. And only being familiar with 1 or 2 stations on the FM radio. It just wasn't that big a part of my life. So thank goodness everything is on the internet these days, so I can make amends and just binge watch all these old performances. So on Live Aid, the Cars just pull off all their songs perfectly without any fuss at all. They just absolutely killed it. And I caught a bunch of their older concerts too, and smoky clubs and arenas, and I gotta say they were a riveting live band. There's just so much going on stage, and they make it all look incredibly easy. They're just a lot of fun to watch. But mostly, though, I fell in love with the Cars' sound all over again. It's just so unique. It's instantly recognizable. You can hear 5 seconds of one of their songs, and it's enough to say, yep, that's the Cars. And you can't say that about a lot of bands. And not only that, but they were the tip of the new wave spear that would include later bands like Devo, The Police, and Talking Heads. And I also love how egalitarian the band was, with everyone contributing to the song. No one person stands out for more than a few bars. You have guitars and keyboards trading leads, and everyone contributing vocals. And they really helped invent the sound of the 80s in the 70s. I mean, let's consider 1976 for a moment, okay? That's when the Cars' debut album came out with classic tracks like Good Times Roll, My Best Friend's Girl, Just What I Needed, You're All I've Got Tonight, and Moving in Stereo. And I guarantee that all these songs are playing on radio channels right now all over the world, even as you're listening to me here. It's just a fact. These are consummate 80s tracks. But they came out in 76, even before punk rock took off. And they're not post-punk. They're pre-punk. It's really insane. Like, I almost expect that we'll find that the Cars had a time machine and they were able to steal a year from the 80s and plop it into the 70s. It's kind of like NASA's Apollo project, the one that landed humans on the moon. And it's been described as NASA plucking a decade out of the 21st century and dropping it in the 20th. And to me, that's what the Cars' music is like. It's a reverse anachronism. So yeah, 1976. What acts were at the top of the charts? I looked it up. We had Peter Frampton, Wings, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles. Look, I've had a rough night, and I hate the Eagles, man. So basically, you had all the worst excesses of corporate rock, exactly what punk would rebel against. And then the Cars show up with a song like Just What I Needed, a rockin' song with wild keyboard leads. I mean, are you kidding me? It was just something different entirely. And you couldn't deny their musicianship or their songwriting, because these are tight, sophisticated, and catchy pop songs that are amazingly well played. And this sound was common in 84, I'll admit, but it must have been shocking to the average radio listener in 76. So who were the Cars? I had the same questions in 1985 after I bought my tape, and I looked them up on the liner notes, and here you go. Here's a picture. So we had Greg Hawkes on keyboard and vocals, Elliot Easton on guitar, David Robinson on drums, Rick Ocasek on lead vocals and guitar, and Benjamin Orr, lead vocals and bass. And I knew one name going into this, that Rick Ocasek was their chief songwriter, and that alone is enough to secure his spot as a legend, right? I mean, think about that for a minute. This guy wrote how many top 10 hits? Dozens of them. These songs are pretty much rock standards at this point. What an accomplishment. But Rick, you may notice here, had a very unusual look that would eventually become iconic. He was a tall, lanky guy, extremely thin, with a shock of black hair, and more often than not, a pair of Wayfarer shades. And in a way, even his face would become a visual shorthand for the Cars. He was the 80s equivalent to a walking, talking meme. But he only sang about half their songs. I knew him from the videos for You Might Think and Magic, which we'll talk about in a bit. Rick was also the darling of the music press because he happened to be married to a supermodel, Paulina Poroskova. As I mentioned in the Weezer episode, this gave hope to all nerdy, gawky guys everywhere. He became our spirit mentor and a reminder that in this best of all worlds, anything was possible. I should point out that I've binged plenty of Cars documentaries, performances, and interviews in the last few weeks. And the one thing I learned is that all the guys were soft spoken, humble, and pretty much the antithesis of the rock star image, at least off stage. And that was also very true for their bassist Ben Orr, who was their other lead singer. Now, Ben was a monster on the bass and just happened to sing a bunch of their hits, too. And he could have justifiably gotten a big head about it. And he was also kind of singled out as the band's heartthrob. And about that, you may know that he was the first car that we lost back in 2000. And he got terribly sick, and he passed away at the too young age of 53. And I'm not just saying it was too young because that's practically the age I'm at now. I mean, let's face it, that's just too young for anyone. But a few months before he passed, Ben did his last interview next to his 4 bandmates and was asked, "Do you consider yourself the sexy one?" Which, is just a dumb question. It's just a stupid question. But to Ben's credit, he just laughed it off. And he said he always kept one foot on the ground. And I quote, "It's just an act, a show. You leave the stage and you're somebody else, and nobody sees that except these guys and the crew," end quote. So what a class act. And again, you gotta love these bands that have multiple lead singers. I have to think it just reduces the whole ego thing. And then we have Elliot Easton on guitar. And what a guitarist. I mean, years ago when I started playing guitar in earnest, I set up a little station with my iPod and my amp so I could play along with all my music, which was really novel, having hundreds and hundreds of songs available at the touch of a button. I mean, we take it for granted now, but it was really an amazing thing at the time. And I just remember spending days trying to approximate Elliot's solo from You Might Think. I was just astounded at how concise and awesome it was and how well it fit into the song. And as I went back through the Cars catalog, I realized all his solos were like that. And it's clear now, watching the old performances, that Elliot simply didn't miss. He just nailed his solos 100% of the time. The guy's a real player, and I know I keep saying that over and over, but it's true. And to prove it, I have to explain, and this is completely nuts. You have to realize that Elliot is a right-handed guy, but he plays left-handed only because the Cars manager suggested it would look cooler with him standing next to Ben Orr. They'd look more like the Beatles' Paul and George sharing a mic with the guitars going each direction. So yeah, Elliot seemed to think that was a reasonable suggestion, so he simply flipped his guitar over, restrung it, and started playing left-handed. Like, why not? I mean, it's completely insane. I mean, normal people can't just do that. Can't just flip it over and continue playing. That's not heard of. The only other person I've ever heard who could do that was Stevie Ray Vaughan, who explained that it kind of made more sense to him to flip the guitar over because intuitively the lower notes were closer to the ground. I mean, I'll just let that sink in for a second. So yeah, Elliot is a guitar prodigy, but he also practiced a lot to hone his talent. And another thing is that he incorporated different styles into the Cars' music. So he could play blues, he could play country, he could play rock, he could play anything. He's just a virtuoso. So for instance, he added rockabilly licks to My Best Friend's Girlfriend, just after the chorus. And I recently watched an old clip of Nirvana covering that tune live, which was kind of cool to see, And their cover was, of course, a bit more rockin', and it was pretty good. But guess what? Kurt Cobain did not play the rockabilly part. And I don't know that he even could have. I doubt a lot of people could have, unless you're talking about, I don't know, like Mojo Nixon or Reverend Horton Heat. And also other guitarists looked up to Elliot. He was recognized as a great guitarist. He wasn't just one of these punk kids with 3 chords and an attitude. Not that there's anything at all wrong with that, but let's face it, if you can play a guitar as well as Elliot Easton, you're going to be the coolest guy in the room, period. So then they had their secret weapon, Greg Hawkes, on keyboards. I mean, holy moly, this guy might have invented the sound of the 80s, but he was doing it in the 70s. And what more can you say? He was on stage playing as many leads as the lead guitarist. He was right up there. He wasn't playing boring pad sounds or long sequence bits or samples or just playing with a single finger. He was playing all these parts, and he wrote all these amazing hooks. Every single Cars song has killer keyboard parts. They're not just filling in the gaps. They're defining the song. They're what you think of when you think of that song. Greg really elevated the position of the keyboard player, like I said, to be co-equal with the guitarist. And I'm positive the sounds he introduced inspired all the new wave acts that would follow. And when I was a little kid, I at first only really learned two names from this band. You know, like I said, I knew Rick Ocasek going into it, but then I learned Greg Hawkes. But I did that because I made a point to learn the name of the guy who was playing all this amazing keyboard. It really blew my mind. So finally, rounding out the band is David Robinson, their somewhat elusive drummer. And it's not easy finding interviews with David. He's a man of few words, and as he put it at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, I'd rather just play. But Rick has talked about how they got him into the band, and it's a kind of funny story. So before they got their record deal, they had a different drummer, and much as with the Beatles, someone suggested that they needed someone better. So they suggested Ringo Starr. They suggested David Robinson. The problem was, David was already a successful rock star. He was playing in the Modern Lovers with Jonathan Richman, and you might remember them from episode 45, the one about Talking Heads, because of course, Jerry Harrison played keyboard with the Modern Lovers during the same period of time, from about 71 to 73. So it's interesting to think of Jerry playing with David, knowing what would happen with those guys in just a few years. Somehow Rick got David's attention and sent him a few of the early Cars tracks, and that was it. David was convinced. He left the Modern Lovers, joined the Cars, and that's how they achieved their classic lineup. By the way, all of this happened in Boston. That's where the Cars got their start, and I've been to Boston a few times, and when I'm there and I'm not enjoying prosciutto di Parma in the North End, I like to stroll through Harvard Square and think about the bands that form there, like the Cars and the Magnetic Fields. And it's also fun to see the window in the former offices of Car Talk. There's still a sign there that says Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Fun fact. But Boston has a cool musical history, and no, I'm not referring to the band Boston, of which I'm not a tremendous fan. So that was the lineup, 5 guys, and as Elliot has pointed out on occasion, it was a very unlikely group. They were all different ages, different backgrounds, with separate but overlapping musical interests, and they just happened to click perfectly as a band. And when they started playing, they just knew they had something special. So let's talk about the tracks on the Greatest Hits album. When this came out in 1985, they had released 5 studio albums. So they had their self-titled debut, they had Candy O, Panorama, Shake It Up, and Heartbeat City. So the first track is Just What I Needed. A classic song, and by classic, I mean timeless. I played it for my kid the other day, and he remarked how it sounded a lot like the bands that he is listening to now, the bands that he likes. And I said, well, sure, because it rocks. I mean, there's just so much to like here. There's Ben's vocals, there's the background vocals, this crazy introduction. There's the verse where David switches to halftime with the snare on the 1 that kind of throws me off every time. I don't know how it didn't throw off the whole band. There's Rick's lyrics that sound so casual and cool, but point to a much deeper relationship. There's Greg's killer keyboard hooks. There's Elliot's killer guitar solo. I mean, it's all there. Every band member shines. And this song, Just What I Needed, is the Cars in a nutshell, folks. And I'm afraid if you can't get behind this track, we can't be friends. Next up, Since You're Gone. This isn't a song that I'd play a lot as a kid, but of course I remember it. It was a radio staple, like just about all of these. And listening back to it now, the things that stand out to me are Elliot's sustained guitar leads. I don't know if he was using an EBO or if it just sounds like it, but the leads are cool as ever. I like how the song builds tension by staying on the chorus for a few extra bars. Rick's lyrics are on point. He says, "Since you're gone, everything's in perfect tense." So if you're like me and you didn't know what the perfect tense was, it's like when you use a verb to denote something that happened in the past, usually with reference to the end state. So for instance, I have listened to the Cars' greatest hits. So it sounds a little bit detached. It sounds a little impersonal, which makes sense since you're gone, right? So it fits the track in a great way. It's just a cool down-tempo track, simple and straightforward. And that goes into You Might Think, which I spoke about at length. And the video for this song immediately comes to mind when I think of it because I watched it a million times as a kid. It's just a goofy and fun video that's got all these computer effects that were cutting edge in '84 but just look quaint now. But it's iconic stuff, really, especially the ending when Rick pulls his face off and water pours out. It might have been MTV's cultural pinnacle when I think about it. But the song itself is just infectious, and it makes me happy every time I hear it. And I understand that the kids these days mostly think it's a Weezer song because it was on the Cars 2 soundtrack. Their cover was on it. And I went out and listened to Weezer's cover. And I have to say it was pretty good, if only because it sounds almost exactly like the original. So you got to hand it to Weezer. Their covers never really stray that far, just like their cover of Toto's Africa. I do love this song, though, and it has one of my favorite lines. You think you're in the movies and everything's so deep. I mean, we've all been there ourselves or been close to someone who was, so we all know that Rick Ocasek is just pointing out the truth like a good reporter. And next up is Good Times Roll, which I always like due to Elliot's upstroke guitar hook. They pretty much built the whole song around that hook, but we have to take a minute here to appreciate their backup vocals, and I always thought that they sounded a bit like Queen's backup vocals, and there is a good reason for that. The Cars, even on their earliest tracks like this one, took full advantage of multi-track recording to layer more than a dozen vocal takes, and that's exactly what Queen was up to in the mid-'70s. So don't get me wrong, with three guys doing backup vocals, they sounded really full live, but on disc, it's just a whole other level. In fact, Rick talked about this in interviews, how when he first heard the playback of these early tracks, he thought they way overdid the vocals. But later, he was okay with it. It just became another part of the Cars' sound, though one that could never really be recreated perfectly live. But that's okay. After all, we know that studio recordings are always a platonic ideal that live takes can only approach. Anyway, this is a nifty song from the first album. Rick provides the vocals, and I definitely remember hearing this on the radio all the time growing up. So next is Touch and Go, and I have to admit, I wasn't very familiar with this tune. The rest of these have been so played and overplayed through the years, but I had to go to YouTube to remind myself what this song even was. And sure enough, there's a video for it and everything. I guess it was the big hit off their third album, Panorama. The video has Rick singing the song on a carousel amidst the band and a bunch of scantily clad ladies. So they probably filmed this video for like $20 at an amusement park. But not a bad song, but slower, you know. And speaking of slower songs, we round out side A with Drive. And yes, if ever there was a ballad to represent all of the 80s, it's this one. The soundtrack to millions of awkward slow dances in middle school. And I can personally testify to that. This is a song that was so hailed and so pervasive that even Sir Paul McCartney himself was influenced by it. If I were in the Cars, I would have that fact proudly etched on my tombstone. But what is it about Drive, though? Is it Ben's buttery smooth vocal delivery? Is it Rick's wistful vocals? Is it Greg's lush synth work? I don't know, but whatever it is, it remains one of the greatest ballads of all time. It's just a timeless classic. And by the way, I just want to point out that this track and the other tracks here from their fourth album, Heartbeat City, were all produced by Mutt Lange. That's right, the guy who would walk away from the Heartbeat City sessions to produce Hysteria for Def Leppard. And fun fact, did you know that Hysteria didn't contain any drum performances by Rick Allen? That's right, all the drum parts were sequenced from samples and played back on the Fairlight CMI. So go back and check out episode 19 about Trevor Horn and the Art of Noise for a deep dive into the Fairlight. One wonders, though, how much David Robinson appeared on Heartbeat City. I really don't know. Anyway, at that point, Teenage Me would flip the tape over and continue with side B, which starts with the aforementioned Tonight She Comes. And this was a track that they made just for this album. It wasn't released on any of the previous albums. So I love this song. Just a consummate Cars track with all their hallmarks. You know, they released it as a standalone single. It has such a great beat. It has an uplifting vibe, great keyboard, and astounding guitar solo. Cool vocals from Rick. I mean, what more could you want? Nothing. That's what. It's just an outstanding song. And then we go back in time to My Best Friend's Girl with the rockabilly licks and cool attitude. Another song that's just all over classic rock radio. But so much better than anything by Boston, let's face it. So, okay, we're going to go on to Heartbeat City. And yeah, this is one of the 4 songs they did at Live Aid. But man, I have to say this song is my black sheep personally. I just don't really get it. It has a real whiff of the new romantic sound to it. Like Duran Duran put it on and made a duck face in front of a mirror and then just like threw it back in the pile. But to me, apart from Rick's vocals, it doesn't sound much like the Cars. Maybe it sounds a bit too airbrushed, sort of like if Bronski Beat had a love child with the Human League. Actually, that sounds like it would be a cool combination. But you know what I mean. It sounds a bit manufactured. Could be my personal bias on that one. Obviously, a ton of people love that song. So yeah, your mileage may vary. Okay, so let's go on to Let's Go. This is a quirky early number, a classic Cars tune, and immediately recognizable as such. Got some nice tom work here from David on the pre-chorus. Cool keyboards, cool guitar, Ben on vocals. You know, it seems to me that Ben Orr is to Martin L. Gore as Rick Ocasek is to Dave Gahan. You know, Ben starts singing and all the ladies go, ah! It's got that effect. And some of the guys, too, no doubt. I mean, Ben was such a great frontman, as much as Rick, really. But I love this song, though. Let's Go is just a great tune. And then we go into I'm Not the One. And again, like Touch and Go, this wasn't a song I heard much back in the day. I don't think it got as much radio play. It's a cool song, though. Sounds to me like David's playing along to a drum machine here. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But I love the backup vocals. They're just very smooth. Obviously, they had about 1 million of them overlaid on each other. But I must be missing something here. I'm not sure why they included this on the Greatest Hits album, because this album does not have other really popular Cars tracks. Like, for instance, Moving in Stereo, which we all know is an iconic song, if only for its rather memorable appearance in the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High, because many of us became men to that song, and that's all I'm going to say about that. But I can hear you saying, look, dummy, I'm Not the One hit number 32 in the Billboard Hot 100, and Moving in Stereo never even charted. And maybe that's true and well and good. I'm just saying that you have to give some consideration to cultural importance and not just go by chart performance. This album also doesn't have You're All I've Got Tonight, which I'd argue is bigger than I'm Not the One. But, you know, quibbles maybe. There's so many great tunes to pick from. Okay, let's move on to the next song, which is Magic. And this was one of my favorites back in the day, maybe second only to You Might Think. And they played it at Live Aid too. And by the way, if you haven't watched the Cars at Live Aid, for God's sake, stop listening to me and go watch it now, because they're just flawless and fantastic. And the songs are different enough that you know they're playing everything live, but the sound recording is top-notch. Props to whoever recorded it. And the band just absolutely nails everything, and they make it look so casual and easy. You're playing in front of 1 billion people, and I know it wasn't. Anyway, Magic is just a great little pop song. It's got sweet guitar riffs, sweet keyboard sounds. The whole song is just like 3 chords, but it's in how they play those chords. And repeat after me, simplicity is power. The song might be best remembered, though, for its video, which famously featured Rick Ocasek walking on water in a swimming pool, hence demonstrating the song's premise. It's a pretty clever video. These days I'm sure they would just CGI the hell out of the thing and it would look flawless. Back in 84, though, they had to build a plexiglass stage and drop it in a big-ass pool. And you can actually make out the stage in the video's closing moments when the other people in the crowd start diving into the pool and making waves. But you see that Rick had this little postage stamp stage to stand on. And by the way, the video was directed by Tim Pope, who you may remember from directing every single video by The Cure ever, which is pretty neat. But, I love this song and I still listen to it regularly. Finally, we round things out with Shake It Up, that I also have on this goofy 80s compilation. Hard Rock Cafe, New Wave. Wow! Check out that absurd cover. I mean, how could anyone resist that? Anyway, looking on the back here, we have Shake It Up by the Cars as track number 2, second only to My Sharona by the Knack. And look what else it's got. We've got In Excess, The Police, Joe Jackson, ABC, The Bangles, Tears for Fears, Thompson Twins, Men at Work, Soft Cell, Simple Minds, Wang Chung, and Culture Club. I mean, this is a pretty badass compilation, second only maybe to my vinyl copy of 1983's Hit Explosion from K-Tel, which someday I will dig out of the vaults. But it's practically a law in the U.S. that every radio station plays Shake It Up at least once an hour. So, yes, I've heard this song countless times. I still dig it. And, a few weeks back, I found this great old interview with Elliot Easton from the mid-'80s because some journalists visited him at his cottage outside of Boston, and they were playing some footage of him in the studio. They cut it in, and they just happened to capture him recording the guitar solo for Shake It Up. And the thing that wowed me was that he just sat down and casually recorded it exactly as you hear it on the record. There was no second take. There was no dropping in. There was no overdubbing. In fact, it is such a cool clip that I'm going to link to it in the description, and I urge you to check it out because Elliot is just a total pro, and that's been backed up by all the live shows that I've watched in the last few weeks. He just absolutely nails his solos every time, period. Just really impressive. But Shake It Up is a neat song. It sounds almost sequenced to me, but it's really not. Greg is just playing a hell of a lot of notes, and Elliot and Rick are doing a lot of palm muting. It's just outstanding musicianship. And that was the greatest hits album, a lucky baker's dozen for the old sweet tooth, as we used to say. So yeah, that album and I go way back. I put a lot of mileage on my knockoff Walkman listening to it back in the day. I just wish I could find the damn cassette. It's in there somewhere. I know it. It's bugging me now. I'm going to have to go back in there and pull everything out and tear it apart and find it. But this is the album that inculcated a love of the Cars into my impressionable young psyche. And have you ever played the Adam Savage drinking game? You drink every time he says inculcated. And, it doesn't take you long. Trust me. So what happened next? Oddly, the Cars would release just one more album with the original lineup. That was 1987's Door to Door, which frankly made little impression on me. Like I said, I was more of a passive Cars fan back in the day, as many of us were. I didn't have to seek them out so much as have them happily foisted on me on the radio and in department stores. But after Door to Door, the band would break up, as so many bands do, as growing egos turned the members' attention to solo projects. And honestly, none of their solo projects even registered with me. I can't think of a single solo tune by any of them. In my imagination, I like to think that these guys always got along perfectly well, as they seem to, as well as they seem to through the band's heyday. But further investigation has alas revealed that that was sadly not always the case, particularly between Ben and Rick. Unfortunately, Ben passed away in 2000 and Rick passed away fairly recently in 2019. But before he did, he talked about his relationship with Ben, and he described it as kind of a Cold War that they never really discussed or investigated fully. Typical guys, like, am I right? So to me, it sounds like some flavor of that old standby artistic differences. If I had to guess, I think Ben maybe wasn't fully satisfied with his role in the band, and Rick seems to have put the kibosh on some of Ben's more wild ideas, like the Cars playing songs written by Ben's girlfriend. So maybe Ben wanted the freedom to do that. It happens even if bands get along. The original lineup did reunite one last time, though, just not to play music. They did a final interview, as I said, in 2000, the one I quoted from earlier. Ben was clearly not well. He didn't speak a lot. But when he did, his love for his bandmates was clear. So I like to think that whatever happened to break them up, it didn't ultimately affect their friendship. And that makes me happy. After Ben passed, Elliot and Greg would form the New Cars with Todd Rundgren on vocals, and that just strikes me as strange. But then I was never aware of them at the time, and to be honest, I probably wouldn't have noticed or cared. To me, having just 40% of the original DNA, so to speak, doesn't make the thing the thing. It's clearly a different thing. You're just chasing after it. And like I discussed in the last episode, it's another Band of Theseus situation. And really, I'm not sure why anyone thought it was a good idea. I guess they probably weren't taking it as seriously as I am now as a fan. Maybe they just wanted to breathe life into these songs again and get up on stage and rock them out. It could have been something that innocent. It makes me think of like when Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger got a bunch of hired guns and called themselves the Doors of the 21st Century. It's kind of cringy and pathetic, but it's also understandable if done in the right spirit. I mean, if it's done as a tribute or to honor the music's legacy and not as a cynical cash grab. The trouble is, as a fan, it's almost impossible to make that distinction. So I'm consciously choosing here to give them the benefit of the doubt. Anyway, it would all be moot because I remember seeing a post on Facebook in 2010 back when I was on Facebook, and it was an image of the 4 surviving Cars hanging out in a studio, and it was a tease for a potential reunion. And lo, it was true. Rick, Elliot, Greg, and David got back together and recorded a new album, their final album, Move Like This, followed by a brief tour. And as yet, I haven't listened to that album, but you know what? I'm going to do it because I'm more curious than ever what it sounds like, especially without Ben. And, it's a bit poignant to me that they didn't get another bassist for that record. They just had Greg play the bass on the keyboard or on a bass guitar. In fact, he used Ben's old bass guitar, which I think is just fantastic. So whereas the New Cars had about 40% of the original DNA, Move Like This had to have about, 81, 82%. So yeah, it's as close to pure uncut Cars as we had any right to get back in 2010. So yeah, I'm going to check that out. So this version of the band played one more time at their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2018, as I said, with Scott Schreiner of Weezer standing in on bass. And unfortunately, Rick passed in 2019 and the Cars finally ended. But their story goes on in the ridiculous amount of chart-topping hits and groundbreaking great music that they made over the years that we can continue to enjoy. So why do I love their greatest hits album? Well, it was the first album I bought with my own money, obviously, and they say your first one is always special. But seriously, though, to me, the Cars are the rarest of things, a popular band that I actually like and respect. So sure, they had a boatload of success, but they paved the way for the music that I love, the kind of music that I make myself today. And the Cars were doing all this when I was still finger painting in preschool. They've just always been there for me. They pick up my mood and brighten my day when I'm sitting in a restaurant, for instance, and it makes me happy that I can share their music with my kids and have them actually like it. They're not just humoring the old man. I mean, I don't think they're just humoring me. I'm pretty sure I could tell if they were, I think. And for what it's worth, I was down here in the bunker blasting some Cars the other night, and Mrs. Stronger Than Reason came down the old bat pole, stopped in her tracks, and said, "Finally, some good music." So there you have it, folks. You're not going to find a stronger endorsement than that. If she likes it, it's gold. And if you think about it, the Cars are in a very small group of bands that everyone loves. And it's interesting to think about that group, isn't it? So who else is in that group? Weird Al, obviously. Probably ZZ Top. And I don't know. That's it. I think that's it. There's no one else. Everyone loves them. So the Cars are not industrial for sure, but they were somewhat alternative, and they were certainly electronic in their way, so they fit into the wheelhouse of this show. And I feel like I would be remiss not to bring this fantastic band to your attention, because they laid the groundwork for so many bands to follow, many of whom I've talked about here. I am 100% positive that Al and Trent listen to and love the Cars. I have zero evidence that that's the case, but I can say it with confidence. And here's the thing. Unlike a lot of their followers, the Cars' sell-by date never really arrived. They still sound as fresh as ever nearly 50 years later. Anyone can still hear them for the first time, stop for a second and say, finally, some good music. And that's why I love them. There you have it, folks. My first cassette purchase, which I tragically can't find at the moment, the Cars' greatest hits. This calls for another expedition into the filthy crawl space, and I wonder what other wonders lurk in there besides the house centipedes and wolf spiders. I mean, wait and see, folks. Wait and see. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast. The show that is already fed up with spring after just 2 weeks. I mean, seriously, can we get to summer already? I'm sick of these overcast, rainy days with the highs in the 40s. I'm sick of gusts up to 45 miles per hour. I mean, Jesus, it feels like I'm living on LV 426. So forget touching grass. I just want to see the sun now and then. Is that too much to ask? Huh? Is it? As always, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.